Let's talk Terminators, one of the most iconic Space Marine designs in all of 40k. The ones that you're probably most familiar with are these ones, the Indomitus pattern newly redesigned for 10th edition. However, they are far from the only type of Terminator armor that we've seen so far. No, we've actually seen quite a few different types of tactical dreadnought armor, and the list is growing all the time. Just recently, we saw the announcement and canonization of the oft-rumored Saturnine pattern Terminator armor. But even before then, we've seen Tartaros pattern Terminators, a few variants of Custodes Terminators, and even a few chapter-specific variants of those Terminator varieties. But amongst all these different varieties of Terminators, one has always stood out to me as being the pinnacle of Space Marine design, the Cataphractii pattern. So welcome to Gone Hollow Minis. My name is Colt, and today we're taking a deep dive into Cataphractii Terminators, looking at their history, their aesthetic, and how to put them on the tabletop in the 41st millennium. Okay, now before we get to hobbying, let's sit down and talk a little bit about Cataphractii Terminator armor, just so that we understand what we're going to be kit bashing. Cataphractii pattern tactical dreadnought armor was developed all the way back during the Great Crusade. As the conflict continued and certain worlds put up more defiance in the face of Imperial rule, battlefields began to become more and more dangerous. Even Ceramite can fail, and so the Legiones Astartes had begun to take heavier casualties than the Emperor might have hoped. The solution to this problem was tactical dreadnought armor, referred to more commonly as Terminator armor. This was thicker, tougher, more heavily armored, and capable of bearing even heavier weapons than regular Space Marines could. The Mechanicum would continue their tinkering throughout the Great Crusade, and in time these prototype Terminator armors would eventually see use on the battlefields of the Great Crusade. The Cataphractii pattern was one of these earlier marks of Terminator armor. Cataphractii armor is fairly large and bulky, at least in comparison to the more standard armor of the Astartes. The most standout features of the armor are in its shoulders and the area around the Legionary's head. The shoulders are incredibly bulky, made of several panels of layered ceramite and further protected by Terurius. That's the historical name, at least as near as I can pronounce it, for these little Greek skirt flap things. Though some Legion-specific variants replaced these with other materials like chainmail, or even entirely omitted them, the general silhouette is a defining feature of Cataphractii armor. Another defining feature can be found here at the head. Where other Terminator patterns feature more open and mobile necklines, Cataphractii armor has an extended neck plate, reminiscent of the gorgets and bevers of medieval European armor design. This, coupled with the articulated and layered appearance of the pauldrons, gives the Cataphractii pattern Terminator armor a distinctly medieval appearance, something that many of the legions would quickly capitalize on. This aesthetic is carried throughout much of the rest of the armor. The legs and arms both have wide sections of trim, often in contrasting metallics. The rear of the legs similarly echo both the layered pauldrons and the legs of Mark II and III power armor, with the same layered appearance. With the Cataphractii pattern Terminator armor being one of the first to be widely adopted by the legions, pretty much every Space Marine legion had at least a few sets, even the White Scars, who are much more famously known for going fast. That said, the Cataphractii pattern Terminator armor did become an essential part of many legions' identities, and I'd like to highlight a few of those specific variants now. Firstly, we have the Dark Angels. While there wasn't a single unit of the Dark Angels that was explicitly known for its Terminators, they were commonly used in the Deathwing. We also see examples of the Hecatonistic Orders outfitting their Cenobiums with Cataphractii plate. The Iron Warriors had their Tyrant Siege Terminators, harnesses of bulked-up Cataphractii plate topped with Cyclone missile launchers, designed to wade through enemy fire, sending volleys of missiles and Stormbolter fire at the enemy. The Space Wolves had the Varagir, aged warriors of Fenris that Leman Russ assigned throughout his legion to spread their expertise, commonly but not always equipped with Cataphractii Terminator armor. The Blood Angels had the Crimson Paladins, also known as the Cheruvim, armed with shields, halberds, and swords, both to stand guard within the Angels' halls and to take their fury to the enemy in close quarters. The World Eaters had the Red Butchers, number 1 on the most likely to eventually be in 40k list. They were bloodthirsty butchers that even omitted the Terurius on their shoulders for more mobility in melee combat. The Death Guard had Grave Wardens, projecting alchemical death through their armor-mounted projection units. I will also say that the chainmail on the shoulders is a really nice addition to the Cataphractii look. And a final example, the Justaran Terminators of the Sons of Horus. These are the guys that set the precedent for the black armor of the later Black Legion. They were the tip of the spear, striking into the heart of the enemy to decapitate the enemy army's leadership. There are, of course, other examples of Legion-specific Terminator variants. These were just some of my favorites. Like I said, literally every legion had access to these guys, some just incorporated them more into their identity than others. And just to wrap things up, why don't we take a moment to talk about real-world cataphracts, because I'm a sucker for both linguistics and history. The term cataphract is a Greek word used to refer to Persian heavy cavalry. The etymology and origins of the word are complicated, as language usually is. But one interesting note I dug up is that cataphract is influenced by this Persian word, meaning neck guard wearer. Definitely fitting for our Terminators, don't you think? Over time, the Greek word is Latinized into cataphractii, which has been simplified in our instance into just cataphractii. And here we have the oft-debated issue of pronunciation. I certainly don't speak Latin, but from my understanding, the technically correct way of pronouncing this word is cataphractii, or at least something close to it. That said, I've been pronouncing it cataphractii because I think it sounds cooler, and because it matches with pronunciation of more common words like cacti, even if there are some different linguistic processes going on here. Point is, we're already fudging the Latin here, just pronounce it how you want. If nothing else, mispronouncing vaguely Latin-sounding words is thematic to 40k. Now that we understand the background of our Cataphractii pattern Terminators, we can get to kit bashing. But we have a couple problems. Cataphractii Terminators do have a plastic kit, but as you can see, it's meant for the Horus Heresy, which means it's in scale with Firstborn Marines, but when compared to Primaris Marines and, God forbid, Primaris Terminators, these guys kinda stick out. So we've got some work to do. I'm starting with a Deathwing Knight and a Horus Heresy Cataphractii kit. Needing 2 kits, this is a bit of a pricey kit bash, but you can also give eBay a look for bits sellers to cut the cost a little bit. There's also no reason why this wouldn't work with standard Terminators either, if that's what you're going for instead. First, we've got to decide which parts of the Cataphractii armor we want to try and emulate with our conversion. Doing a complete conversion just isn't really realistic, so we're going to have to figure out which details from each kit we want to preserve. First and foremost are the arms, or more specifically the shoulders. The Teruges and the layered pauldrons are pretty essential to the Cataphractii silhouette, so I think that's where we should start. We could just stick the Cataphractii shoulders onto our Primaris Terminators, but that leaves them looking a little bit stumpy. So instead we've got to do a shoulder swap. The problem we're going to run into is that the Teruges are modeled a little bit too naturally. They're sculpted brilliantly, flowing over the arms naturally, but making it a little hard to find a nice flat spot to make our cut. A lot of this will just come down to choosing the right arms. If you can, try to find the ones without the power fist. No worries if you can, but the more oblong shape of the power fist will make our kit bash a little bit harder. Once I picked my arm, I can find the angle that gives me the straightest cut across the arm. We only want this upper section of the shoulder, so the rest of the arm has to go. I definitely recommend using a hobby saw for this. We want this cut to be as flush as possible, and using a hobby saw is the best way to make that happen. Once we make the cut, we need to go back through and remove the scraps of trim that remain. We want the stump to be as close as possible to the width of our regular Terminator arm, and the trim gets in the way of that. Once our shoulder is cleaned up, we can do the same thing with our regular Terminator arm. Same deal here, just use a hobby saw to make a nice flush cut below the shoulder. This may take some tinkering later, depending on the angles of either piece, but it'll give us a starting point. It takes a bit of tinkering to get these parts to line up. In particular, I found that I usually needed to trim away the little tube details on the upper Terminator arm. They just don't really match the cross-section of the shoulder stump, so it's just easier without them. But once we've sanded everything to more or less line up correctly, we can go ahead and attach the arms and shoulders together. Don't worry about gaps, we'll go in with some green stuff and fix those later. But once everything's attached, we can start to see how our pose will come together with a little bit of poster tech. But before we permanently attach the arms, there is one more detail that I want to include, and that's the gorget we've talked so much about. This is definitely a more invasive part of the process though, so if you want to build these Cataphractii Terminators on their own, maybe skip this part. Personally, I've had this box of Cataphractii Terminators mostly unbuilt for quite some time now, but I would totally understand if you just want to leave it at the arms. Once we've picked our donor torso, it's time to get snipping. Again, we only need the gorget part, so we'll have to trim back a lot of this torso. Using a pair of clippers that I don't mind messing up, I can start hogging away some of the material below the gorget. Of course, being more and more careful as I work my way towards the neck. Once I'm down to just the neck piece, I can start by sanding down the bottom of this part so that it'll fit flush in the Deathwing Knight's neck seal. The angles actually match up pretty identically already, it's more so just a matter of cleaning up the burrs from the trimming step. You'll also need to cut a little bit off of the back corner of the gorget so that it fits flush on the hood part of the armor. Don't trim too much off, just snip the corner and sand the rest of the way, or you'll risk things fitting a little bit too close together. Once everything dry fits correctly, we can go ahead and glue our gorget on. After that, it's time for some cleanup. Even keeping things as lined up as possible, there will be gaps between some of the joints, so we can solve that with a little bit of green stuff. The most important part is around the arms. I just mix up some green stuff, tear off a small chunk, and squish it in between the shoulder and the arm. Then I use a silicone sculpting tool and a little bit of water to smooth that into the rest of the arm, making for a seamless gap between our two pieces. The gorget also gets a little bit of gap filling. This was done by mixing up a thin snake of putty and sculpting it into the neck seal and robes to blend the two together. I used the exact same silicone sculpting tool here as well. From this point, we've just got to take care of the rest of our details. I'm building this guy to use as a Deathwing Knight, so I'm taking some inspiration from the older Deathwing Command kit with this big kitbashed halberd, and mixing in some 30k Dark Angel Cenobite vibes with this backpack topper. After that, it was time for a little bit of paint before our Kitbash Primaris scale Cataphractii Terminator was ready to hit the battlefield. This might have been one of the more expensive kit bashes I've done, since both types of Terminator kits are a little pricey, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't think it was worth it. The combination of Cataphractii and Indomitus Terminator armor really helps highlight the coolest aspects of both, adding to a really unique unit to field in your Space Marine army. It's also of course worth noting that while I used Deathwing Knights for this, you can absolutely do this with regular Terminators. Some of the helmets might take a little bit more work to fit behind the Gorget, but I think it would still look amazing nonetheless. Thank you all so much for watching this deep dive into Cataphractii Terminator armor. Hope this video gave you some ideas on how to bring some of these lost aesthetics into your 40k armies. If it did, why not drop a like? Leave a comment if you have any questions, subscribe and turn on notifications to not miss the next kit bash, and until we meet again friends, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.